Sullivan Anderson, and I'm the President and CEO of Your BBB. This is a little bit of a heavy topic this morning, but such a great topic. And I am really excited to have Shawn here with Bromwich+Smith to talk about managing debt. Shawn and I were talking before the call just about community and trust and how important it is. And honestly, I can't think of a topic more important where we need to make sure that we are starting with trust. So thank you so much for being here, everybody. Thanks for taking time and allowing yourself to just be vulnerable to receive this information today and to open yourself to any questions that you have. A little bit about Shawn. Shawn is a licensed insolvency trustee and the VP of Insolvency Practice at Bromwich+Smith. With almost 20 years experience working in the insolvency field, Shawn has learned enough to know that he still has a great capacity to learn even more with each and every day that is presented to him. From providing formal mentorship and training to candidates enrolled in the licensed insolvency trustee training since 2012, through to countless public presentations on insolvency and budgeting matters throughout the community, to being a guest speaker on radio and podcasts, articles and video blogging, Shawn's passion for sharing his knowledge and worldview is so evident and always at the forefront of what he's doing. When not practicing as a licensed insolvency trustee, Shawn likes to spend his time with his wife, his 2 daughters, and writing and recording music. How fantastic. What a great balance, Shawn. I'm also super thrilled to say that Bromwich+Smith is also one of our finalists in our upcoming Torch Awards. So the Torch Awards really celebrate marketplace leaders. And so I couldn't be more thrilled to have you here today, Shawn and Bromwich+Smith. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you have a fantastic presentation. As I said, we'll allow time at the end for questions and answers. Everybody's lines have been muted, so go ahead and enter any questions that you have into the chat. And on that, I will turn it over to you, Shawn. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Mary. Everyone is doing well today. I'm going to be, so a little bit about me, as Mary had shared with you. I'm actually one of the stakeholders and shareholders at Bromwich+Smith. And my focus today is really to talk about the business, your business and you, and of course, understanding a path going forward. I've got the presentation that's up right now, and I'm not going to be able to see the questions that are popping up until the end of this, but I will try to anticipate the questions as we go through this, and hopefully we have a good time with this. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about here is, and I imagine everyone's like, oh, why are we talking about nouns and verbs? Basically, what we're looking at today, and when we look at how we serve our community as a business, it's important to understand sort of the difference of the word business when it comes to noun versus a verb. And we've got the guy here holding his head because clearly lots of people get headaches from proper grammar because we're not all very goodly at it. So basically what a noun is it's a person, place, or a thing, and a verb is an action thing. So the legal structure in which you provide business services is important. And it's important because it impacts your relationship with your creditors. So business as a noun or as a thing, so you can operate a business in different ways. You can operate as a sole proprietorship or a partnership that's not incorporated, or you can operate as a corporation. So as a sole proprietor, you and the business are effectively the same legal entity, so you're the same noun. Now, whether or not you're calling yourself by a trade name, you're still a sole proprietor, so all of the debts would fall onto you in your personal capacity. And you would be providing the service in your personal capacity. When you're providing services through a corporation, you and the business are separate legal entities. So you're separate nouns. So there's yourself and you're the noun of the business that you would have. So for example, let's say you were operating as, if I was operating as Shawn's Public Speaking. If I was just operating as a sole proprietor, that trade name, Shawn's Public Speaking, is the same as Shawn Stack, who I am. If, however, I incorporated my business and called myself Shawn's Public Speaking Limited, what I would do is, through the assistance of legal counsel, I would open up a corporation which becomes a separate legal entity, separate and apart from me. And the service I would be providing would be through that corporate entity. So it wouldn't, any problems with that wouldn't necessarily transfer through onto me personally unless I personally guaranteed it. So you are a natural person and the corporation is a person, but it's a legal person. Now, business as a verb, though, it's the service that your business provides to the community. So it's important to understand that we sometimes as a people, we confuse the business verb and the business noun, right? So people say, I have to shut down my business. If you're unable to pay your debts, you shut down your business and you start again. Well, it depends on what that business is. So the business as a verb, no one can stop you from providing a business service, provided that it's a legal business service. The law is not going to stop you from providing that business service to the community. Now, it can be the case if you have a corporation that business, and you can't see me, but I'm air quoting here with my fingers, to air quote, the business as a noun may shut down because it is a separate legal entity from you, but you would continue on and you could open up another corporation, or you could operate as a sole proprietorship, and we're going to get into that in a bit here. So it doesn't matter how you provide the service, whether it's as a sole proprietor or as a corporation, because the service itself arguably will remain the same. Because ultimately, as you all know, our business is our relationship to our stakeholders within the community. And the relationship of the stakeholders to the business, however, can differ based upon how you're operating the business as a verb. So as a sole proprietorship, you are directly tied into the consequences of the contracts, including any sort of liabilities in connection with that. They'll come directly onto you in your personal capacity. So notwithstanding that I call myself Shawn's Public Speaking, that's still me. So I can't, if I agreed to provide a service and didn't provide it, when the lawsuit, if there was a lawsuit that would come, it would come directly as against me. I am personally responsible for that. And again, as I was saying before, if it was operating through a corporation, it doesn't result in the individual being personally liable for the contracts because it's the corporation that's there. So a corporate relationship, though, so they sometimes call that the corporate veil. So a corporate relationship can be altered, though, through a contract or through a statutory application. And what I mean by that is, if you go to the bank and you get a loan for your corporation, oftentimes it's the case that the bank is not going to loan the money to your corporation unless you also have co-signed on that loan as a co-borrower, which means you're jointly and severally responsible for that. So it's almost like it was a sole proprietorship. Or they will ask for you to have a personal guarantee as against what that loan is. And in a lot of cases, with small businesses, almost everything is going to be personally guaranteed that way. Same thing with your trade suppliers. It's unlikely, although possible, it is unlikely that they would just extend services to your corporation unless they have a long history with that corporation itself. Usually there'll be some type of personal guarantee that's associated with that. Now, the same thing would go on in an employee and an employer relationship. So if you have someone that's employed by you, you understand that you'd be, they're on your payroll, you're responsible to withhold their source deductions, right? So let's say you're going to pay them $20 an hour. Well, you wouldn't give them the $20 and end it there, because if you had that relationship with them, you would have engaged with them as a business entity themselves. So whether they were operating, and in that particular case, they would be a sole proprietor. So what you need to do is you need to get their social insurance number because you're going to report that as an expense. If they're your employee, you're responsible to withhold that the source deductions. And that source deductions, that has to be remitted to Canada Revenue Agency. Now, in the event that the relationship that's held with that employee is through a corporation, so it's not you that's has the relationship with the employee. It's the corporation that you're the director of has the relationship. Because you're directing the corporation, if you've not paid your source deductions, the corporation source deductions in relation to what you've withheld from the employee, then what's going to occur is Canada Revenue Agency will do what's called a director's liability assessment, and they'll turn to the corporation and say, you have to pay us this money, and when the corporation doesn't pay it, they'll turn to the director and officers and say, you were directing this and you withheld this money, so you have to pay it to us. That's called a deemed trust claim. So the word trust in the legal side of things, certainly in the personal side of things, there's a trust. Trust is based upon commitment and fulfilling the commitments and relationships. On the legal side of things, the trust there's certain pieces that have to be met to reach the definition of trust. So there has to be a certainty of object, a certainty of subject, and a certainty of intent with respect to this. So what happens is when you withhold this money from your employees, that it doesn't meet the definition of a legal trust. So what Canada Revenue Agency does is they've amended their statutes to say that it meets the definition of a statutory trust or a deemed trust. So what they're able to do is they're able to convert that debt that if you haven't paid the source deductions, they're able to convert that into assets of the corporation and say, okay, well, we're going to be attaching ourselves to this vehicle, for example, and they can register a lien on it and they can basically take possession of that. In the event that you were not a corporation, that aspect of attaching to assets will actually attach to your personal assets. Excuse me. And the same thing can happen with GST because it's kind of the same sort of principle. So the relationships to the stakeholders, although when we consider our relationship to the individuals within the community that we serve, although we are effectively what our business is, on the legal side of things, and when it comes to liabilities, it can be a little bit different. Now, what's important to understand is all of us as entrepreneurs, we are effectively our business. Okay, and I mean this more in the metaphysical sense of that we're our business. We likely don't consider ourselves separate from our business, regardless of whether or not we're operating as a sole proprietorship or through a corporate entity. How we typically apply things, and this is what makes us successful entrepreneurs, is that my success is based upon my customer satisfaction. And we also think that my success is my business success. And when we're fortunate enough to develop our customer base larger and larger, and we hire employees, what we attempt to do is we attempt to instill within our employees the same concept, right? In that we want our employees to think, hey, my success is my customer's success, and by consequence, the business's success. So when we look at the business side of things, business as a verb or as an action thing, we need to kind of consider all of the pros and cons of the business structure that we're using, considering our current situation and our desired outcomes. So this here is This is a quote by or it's not really a quote. Well, it is a quote. It's actually the title of his book. Buckminster Fuller invented the geodesic dome. So I'm not sure if I would imagine everyone's seen there's a house that's on the left side of I think it's Highway 2A as you're driving up to Edmonton. And it's round. Those are geodesic domes. So they were designed by this character by the name of Buckminster Fuller. And he released this book in the late 60s, early 70s called I Seem to Be a Verb. And what he meant by that is as a human being, we act as an action thing. We're not non-action things. And we tend to think of a noun as a sort of a static, something that you would point at. So what's important to understand that as an entrepreneur, it doesn't necessarily matter how you've arranged to provide the service to the community. What really matters to us as entrepreneurs is usually that we're doing it on our own terms and that we're doing a good job at it. So what it comes down to when we say, hey, how should I structure myself? Should I structure myself as a sole proprietor or should I structure myself as a corporation? We have to consider what's the relationship going to be with the people that we're working with. And also, what is the tax implications of this? Because what you have to remember, if you've incorporated if you've incorporated your business, that business is now a separate person within the community, and that person then is required to file tax returns, as are you. And if that person doesn't file the tax returns, it's going to have all the same consequences as against that person, the corporate entity, from CRA as would fall onto you. So we have to sort of weigh the balance and the cost associated with incorporating or not incorporating. Now, in certain cases, some companies will refuse to allow a subcontractor on the premises unless they're incorporated. And the reason why they're doing that is they want to further distance the relationship of the business the service that you're providing to the business that company is. So they might say, well, I'm only going to deal with a corporation because it furthers that distance between them. So ultimately, it's going to come down to what is the relationship. What is it that you're providing to the community, and what is the relationship that the community wants back with you? So this is sort of the meat and potatoes of where things are at. As we frame all that, what's important to understand is that every contract that we enter into, and we agree to provide for and or receive certain goods and services in exchange for something else. That's essentially what a contract is. And we make promises and we make predictions. So whether the contract that you have entered into is subject to sort of the written legally scrutiny of the courts, or whether or not it's really just subject to the social currency of what you're providing to the community, in many ways, it doesn't particularly matter, usually I find, when you're speaking with a successful entrepreneur or anyone that you really want to be dealing with, because it's not so much what the contract says, it really comes down to the personal commitment that the individual makes. So the promise to fulfill a contract is always based on the ability for the parties to do so. And that is, of course, based upon the assumptions and a prediction of what the future events may look like. And I realize that sounds sort of so simple to the point of silliness, but it's very important to understand that every time we enter into a contract and we say, yeah, I'm going to do this, or we make a promise, we do so under the auspice that I'm going to be able to fulfill it. And if something comes up, it's important that we speak to the other and say, hey, this is what the scenario is. So all of us, of course, we've entered into situations and we've made a commitment to someone and we've been unable to keep that commitment due to unforeseen circumstances. Okay, so an example I often use is if you're running, let's say you're having lunch with somebody, and I realize that might be a bit of a sore spot right now since we can't actually, with social distancing, we're not meeting in restaurants to conduct business like we normally would, let alone even just to interact with one another. But if you're running late, although your inclination may be to, okay, I'm not going to call, I'll just show up and seek forgiveness, that can actually go really sideways, right? So what we need to do is if we run into unforeseen circumstances and we're unable to keep our commitments, it's important that we reach out to the individual and we look for their acceptance of the situation, and we try to make a new arrangement, right? So if we're running late for lunch, we say, hey, I'm not going to be there at noon. Obviously, what your partner is going to want to know is, well, when are you going to get here, right? And it's important to understand that when you're going to get there is really all that matters to the person that's eating lunch, because they want to know, am I going to eat lunch with you, or are we foregoing lunch for today? If you say you're on your way and you say, I'm going to be there in 10 minutes, and in reality, you're not going to be there in 10 minutes, inevitably, you're going to have to restart that negotiation again 10 minutes later, and you're going to lose faith within them. So what's important, of course, is that when we look at seeking forgiveness, we also have to have to be empathetic to the person that we're looking to seek that forgiveness from. And of course, I bring all this stuff up because as entrepreneurs, as people in the business community, I'm not just speaking about you asking for forgiveness. I'm speaking of people asking of forgiveness of you to say, hey, I need some time in relation to paying my bill that I have with you, right? So the most difficult of times that we're involved in requires the greatest of empathy. And of course, that's what as a community we're going through right now, is it requires a tremendous amount of empathy of how we got here, what is our situation. But in many ways, empathy is also working with someone for a path forward to get where they need to get to. So really what this comes down to is negotiating arrangements with either your creditors or your debtors, right? The inability to negotiate is a tremendous, it will be a tremendous hindrance to a successful entrepreneur. If you cannot negotiate, if we're so hard-lined in what we want, oftentimes it'll be the case that nothing will work out for us, right? So Nietzsche says that a strong will and holding a position, even in the face of overwhelming information to the contrary, is a sign of a will, a great character, of a strong will. But it's also sometimes a will to stupidity, because it looks only towards holding on to this one position as opposed to the larger outcome of things. So when we negotiate something, what we need to look at is we need to say, and again, this is part of empathy. It's saying, what do I believe is my best situation, and what do I believe is my worst situation, if you follow me. So there's different ways in which we can go about negotiating arrangements, and essentially it's really just two. One is an informal arrangement, where it's just you talking to someone, and the other is a formal arrangement. So basically an informal arrangement, it's you or a representative speaks to the party or parties, and you reach a mutually agreed upon new arrangement. Now, this is a terrific low-cost way of doing things, and arguably, this should always be the first step, right? A formal arrangement, and I see now with my slide here that they're both number one, hey, instead of 1 and 2. That was all on purpose. I know you might be thinking, hey, he made a mistake. No, it's all the same. So The formal relationship is actually when you would use an LIT like myself to engage in a forced arrangement. Okay. Now, before we go down that path of a forced arrangement, we need to understand something. And I'm sure we all do know this intuitively. We just probably haven't ever said it aloud. But it's easier to make an unhappy customer happy than it is to find a new customer. And if we believe that, and I think we have every reason to believe something like that, it builds our relationships within the community. It builds a better community as well, right? So when we look at this, how do you deal with an unhappy customer? Well, you address the situation. So you listen to them. What the scenario is, and you repeat it back to make sure, yep, do I understand this, by clarifying and agreeing upon what the fact scenario is. Then you set up a plan to correct and gain agreement on that plan, right? You don't just say, okay, well, I'm going to take care of it. You actually say, well, what if we did this and this and this and this? And then, of course, you implement it and you follow up during the execution and at the end of it, right? Because, and I know some of you might be shaking your head and saying, well, there's certain customers that you just can't make happy. And that may very well be the case, but I think as members of the community, we do have a duty to do our best to create a community, which is to hear and to listen and help someone get to a resolution. Nobody wants to be offended or disappointed, but inevitably we all may be offended and disappointed in things that have happened, but we have to develop that trust and that relationship with our customers in order to facilitate a growth in business and a better business community. And what's important to understand is that although I'm speaking of, you need to do this with a customer, I want you to remember you are a customer as well. Okay, you are a customer to your creditors. You are a customer to your bank when you're paying the money. So when you're not paying, right, we tend to look at it and we think, oh my goodness, my creditors are going to be so mad at me. Well, no, you are, in their perspective, an unhappy customer. So how do you make that customer happy, right? Now, the creditors don't want to lose you as a customer. They don't want you going into bankruptcy. They don't want you finding another creditor and buying them out and them losing out on that interest. What they want to do is they want to address the situation, clarify and agree upon some facts, and set up a plan to correct it, and then make sure it works through it. So an informal negotiation, you can do that on your own by telephoning them. Well, of course, the difficulty is if there's so many of them, it becomes nearly impossible to deal with them, like the multiplicity of creditors that you're dealing with, and run your business, and of course grow your business, and of course make your customers happy, because inevitably we're going to be working on that as well. So it can then move into a formal arrangement. And this usually is used when informal arrangements fail, or if it just doesn't seem appropriate. And this might involve, if you're on the other end of the receiving of it, it could be a formal demand letter. So let's say you're waiting for payments from you've invoiced someone and they haven't paid you yet. Well, you might call them, you might talk to them, hey, when is this coming? They'll make some arrangements, you'll make some arrangements, send it an email. But then you might say, no, I'm sending a formal demand letter, right? It's gotten to that stage because you want to make sure that you're properly papering these things. It might then mean engaging legal counsel to follow up on that, because what they're going to want to do is they're going to want to have a lawsuit and get a judgment against the receivable, the person that hasn't paid, and then of course look to garnishee and things like that, which is where it can move over to into there. It could also be entering into a forbearance agreement. So what this means is it says, hey, I have the right to take all of these actions against you, but I'm not going to be taking these actions against you. And the reason why I'm not going to take these actions against you is because I'm going to agree to these particular terms, and provided that you do these things, we're going to leave it as it is. Now, the last thing is, of course, a receivership and or a bankruptcy or a proposal. Now, I've written it from this side, on the formal negotiation side, as if you are the creditor seeking payment. But this can just as easily reverse the other way around. And so it's important to understand that no matter what's occurring, we want to go back to this side, this other idea of the informal negotiation, or attempting to make an unhappy customer happy, okay? Because if you have entered into arrangements with someone, so let's go back to that lunch example. They say, hey, I'm going to be 5 minutes from now, and they don't show up in 5 minutes, you likely will go to a place of concern, right? Because it's like, okay, well, I hope they're okay because they're not here. But soon it may actually move into feeling slighted, that you've not been given the respect that you would respect and the truth of what the situation is. Now, that word truth can be very debatable in this sort of post-truth world that we live in. But what I mean by that is I mean an accurate representation from an honest reflection on what can and cannot be done. I would volunteer teaching debt and credit management at Momentum, and I used to ask people if they, I would say, listen, if you could leave this room here, so Momentum's here in Calgary, and I said, if you can show up in my office in Edmonton by driving, and you can get there in 45 minutes, we'll give you $10,000. Okay? Now, it's an impossibility to get there in that time frame because it's roughly 2.5 hours away. Now, in the event that someone said, well, hey, Shawn, and they've said it to me, Shawn, you have to try, right? I have to try. I mean, that's $10,000 on the line. The reality is there's not $10,000 on the line because it's an impossibility, because time and space are a constant, and they're not going to be able to fold space and get there in a shorter time frame. So it's important when we make arrangements with people, we have good faith in those arrangements, and we don't damage that good faith by making, I say, an idle promise. And what I mean by that is it's not predicated on actual knowledge that we're able to actually go forward through. Now, why this is so important is that when it comes to the formal negotiation, there's 4 principles in our insolvency legislation that you and I as a people have here in Canada. And the first one is the rehabilitation. So, excuse me, the concept of rehabilitation is to allow the overburdened debtor, whether that's a business or a consumer, and by business I mean a tradesperson or a corporation, or even just a consumer, because we are one of the highest, I read this morning, it's $1.76 is owed for every dollar that's earned. We're one of the highest indebted nations in the world. But the idea here is to allow someone to be freed from the crushing burden of their debt, and so they're able to move into a better place for the future, because that's ultimately what the objective of the insolvency legislation is it's future focused, to say, hey, let's get someone out of a bad situation now and help them rebuild their worth and get to a better place going forward. So the first principle is rehabilitation. Part of that rehabilitation is, of course, maybe not going into bankruptcy. Maybe it's restructuring the debt. Maybe it's offering different terms, changing payments down. The second principle is the control and distribution of what the assets are of the individual. Now, what's important to understand about this is that from a creditor point of view, you might say, I want to make sure that I'm concerned that this individual is taking my assets and they're going somewhere else with it, right? Or their assets, and they're selling them and they're funding their business that I don't think is viable right now. So you might want to use this legislation to attempt to exert some control over that. The third principle of this legislation is to investigate. Now, investigate's a bit of a loaded word, and I was speaking with Mary about this a little earlier. How we approach things here is not so much as investigation, but more as disclosure, right? So one of the requirements when you're looking at any type of, personally, I believe even in formal negotiation, you should give full disclosure. But under formal negotiations, you absolutely, unequivocally must make full disclosure of what's gone on in the past year as far as your assets go, and outlining what your assets are and what your income and that is. And the reason being is because the fourth principle is to promote faith within the system that we have. And what we want to make sure of is that we all want to live in a community that says if you're overburdened by debt, you're able to exercise your rights and restructure that. But we also want to live in a community that requires, in the event that you've done something that's untoward, that stuff's able to be reversed and be corrected. Because there's a difference between there's justice that says, hey, you have to pay everything all the time, right? And then there's grace that says, we understand a commitment was made, there was a promise made, but given these circumstances, the prediction that the promise was based on, those assumptions didn't come to fruition, so we need to restructure. So really what it comes down to then is we, of course, have options. And at this stage, I'm going to sort of switch it from before where I was talking about as a creditor. I want to talk about the options as an individual. Now, and this can all be, your creditors are aware of this, and if you are a creditor and looking for someone is looking to settle with you, this would apply as well. Okay, so the options that are available are listed here. There's one is do nothing. Okay, so one is the orderly payment of debts, which is offered through a company called Money Mentors. This is under Part 10 of the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. And so that act is all the way across Canada, so it's applicable in every province. But Part 10 has not been put in place in all provinces. The provinces reviewed it and said, we're not interested in introducing this into our system of restructuring because there's similar provincial legislation that allows you to do that as well. Those are operated through, it's called debt management plans or DMPs. There's also a consumer proposal, which is effectively a forced settlement, which we're going to go into, or there's a bankruptcy, which, of course, we all kind of know what a bankruptcy is, but we don't really know what it is. It's a bankruptcy is this understanding within our community that that sort of the game is over in a lot of ways. In fact, if you're playing games and you go bankrupt, Monopoly, the game's over for you. Well, that's not the case in real life. Bankruptcy is an opportunity to restructure, reset, and start again, and you don't necessarily lose everything. So I want to go through sort of the high-level details on this, bearing in mind the times that we have here, so we can get to some questions. So the orderly payment of debts, this is where essentially you have to pay back all of the debts to your creditors, and it usually has to happen over a 3-year period, but it can be longer if the creditors accept it. Okay, the interest rate is by statute set at 5%, and then I believe there's a small fee in relation to the administration, but I believe Money Mentors will actually return that back to you if you attend some sessions. I'm not 100% sure on that. What's interesting is that this is not binding on the Crown. Okay, so this isn't binding on CRA or creditors that are owed over $1,000 unless they agree to it. Now, odds are they may agree to it, but this is an important qualification in relation to it, and there's no stay of proceedings unless, again, that the creditors agree to it. So what a stay of proceedings is it's something that stops all of the creditors' actions, right? Basically what you're doing with the orderly payment of debts is you're giving your creditors a judgment against you, and then you'd be required to pay that judgment. And if you didn't, and the program failed, they would be able to garnish you because you've given a judgment. The other option then is, and which is a much more popular option, this is across Canada, you require a licensed insolvency trustee to do something like this. Now, there's all sorts of licensed insolvency trustees within the community. What I would encourage you to do is read reviews about them and really read the reviews. Like if it says, oh, they were terrific, I would encourage you to look at, does this represent an experience of the individual? Are they sharing what their story is, or are they simply, is it, I don't want to say a bot, but does it actually reflect a human exchange? Because what's important to understand about this is, although this is a financial restructuring, this is very much a human exchange of empathetic understanding. So what happens with a stay of proceedings, there is a consumer proposal, there is a stay of proceedings immediately. So what that means is all legal action stops. So if you're getting garnishee, that stops. If you're getting telephone calls, all of that stops. And then what occurs is it's a forced settlement on the creditors. Now, some people will say, hey, you ask your creditors if they'll accept it. And that's actually an incorrect way of looking at it. Basically, what happens is this is a settlement that the administrator or the trustee, the licensed insolvency trustee, assists you to create. And what it does is it binds the creditors, and they have 45 days in which to submit claims to the trustee and request a meeting. Okay. Now, if 25% of the proven dollar value of the creditors want a meeting, then we have one with them. However, at that meeting, every dollar that's owed is worth one vote. So it's always according to a majority vote. So it's not a question, if you have a minority creditor, let's say they have 26% of the debt, they could call a meeting, but at the meeting, if the other creditors voted for the proposal, it would just go through, and that other creditor would be, not a great way of saying it, but it would essentially be that settlement would be crammed down upon them. They could, of course, request that this get reviewed by the court, but the court is going to look at it and say, well, what's the will of the general body of the creditors? And again, so that's the second principle that we talked about a little earlier. The first one is rehabilitation. Second one is the control and distribution of the assets for the equitable treatment of the creditors. So equitable talks about appropriately treating the creditors, and so that's where this voting comes from. And incidentally, that's what the consumer proposal is a rehabilitative restructuring that doesn't require sort of the bankruptcy side of things. Because what happens in a bankruptcy is you would actually lose certain assets. So you can see here on the consumer proposal, you keep all your assets. Now, a consumer proposal can be either a lump sum, right? So it can come from a family member, or it can be monthly, and it can go up to a maximum of 5 years. The payment that you're making, the monthly payment that you're making, is going to be based upon your budget. So the trustee will assist you in creating a budget, and we'd look at what's left over at the end of the month after you've covered your living expenses, and we'd look at offering that to the creditors. Now, the important thing is that you have to offer more than what's owed, but less than what they would recover in a bankruptcy. Now, it's a certainty of a process, but not necessarily a certainty of an outcome. So it is important to understand, it's a certainty of a process and a certainty of an outcome. You're going to know the outcome within a 45-day period, whether or not you're going to have a meeting with your creditors. Why would they want a meeting? Well, what we would do is, as the trustees, we would provide the creditors a comparison of what would occur in a bankruptcy. So in a bankruptcy, what would occur is all of your assets would vest and belong to the trustee, and it would be our job to monetize them. But certain assets are exempt from distribution, so it means that we wouldn't be able to give those assets to your creditors, and that's these ones here. So here in Alberta, you're allowed $4,000 in clothing and personal effects, as well as furniture. You're allowed a motor vehicle that doesn't have more than $5,000 in equity. So equity is defined as value minus the amount that's owing on it. You're allowed principal residence of up to $40,000 equity in it. So again, value minus what's owing on it, but we also can kind of consider the selling costs in relation to that. All of your RRSPs and your RASPs are exempt. So whatever you do, don't go redeeming those things to be paying your debts down because your creditors aren't entitled to them, okay? Certain life insurance policies are exempt as well, and it depends on who the beneficiary is. And usually it's linear, so it's parents, spouse, or children, provided that they're the named beneficiary, your creditors can't have it. And of course, what would apply to us here as entrepreneurs are tools of trade. So the intention of the legislation is not to remove from you the tools that you need to do your job. So that's why we'd have $2,000 in tools there. Now, what's important with respect to bankruptcy, though, is that any after-acquired property that you get will belong to the creditors, right? So you get in tax refunds, inheritances, or lottery winnings. That's going to belong to your bankruptcy estate, is what it's called, until such time as you're finished with your bankruptcy. And you can see underneath there, the length of bankruptcy all depends on certain situations. So it's a minimum period of 9 months, but it could go longer if you make over a certain amount of money. So if you've not been bankrupt before and you make less than a guideline amount, you'd be done in 9 months. If you make more than that guideline amount, it goes on for 21 months. If you've been bankrupt before, it's 24 months, and it goes on to 36 months if you make over that guideline. But it can be even longer if you owe money to, if you have to go to the court, because the court's not bound by these timelines. Now, typically what happens is bankruptcy will provide the least amount to the creditor, to the creditor. So if you're a creditor and someone's offered you a consumer proposal, I know you may look at it and go, well, I don't want that. I want to get more money. Well, if the consumer proposal is offering more than the bankruptcy, it's often a better case that you take that rather than taking your chances at court. But I'd leave that to you and your legal counsel if you're considering that. Now, personal bankruptcy offers a certainty of a process, but not necessarily a certainty of an outcome. So what I mean by that is you may not, you don't know what the outcome is. So you can kind of set out what the expectation is of what can happen, but you don't really know what's going to happen until you get to the end. So it's sort of like a piece of string. If someone were to say, hey, how long is a piece of string? Well, you have to measure it. And if it's in a spool, it takes that time to measure and you're unwinding everything. Whereas a consumer proposal offers sort of a forced, we look at what do we think would happen in a bankruptcy, how much money would come in, and we offer them just a little bit more than that over that time frame. Now, again, last thing, you could do nothing. Now, doing nothing is never a great option, okay? And what I mean by that is that doing nothing, although we might not want to move, your creditors will eventually move on to you, okay? So they will come after you. So when doing nothing, you should only be using this as a time to assess your situation and plan for the next move. There's a saying in carpentry, it says cut twice and measure once, I think, or something like that. Pause for humor. I guess I can't hear anybody. In any case, you measure twice, cut once, right? So we want to assess things. We want to measure. We want to be cognizant of what we're doing, but we need to move forward. We don't want to stay in a holding pattern for too long. And that's why it says at the end, be wary of not falling into the data trough trap. Okay, and what I mean by that is I just want this information. I just want this information. I want this information. I need to know this. I need to know this. I need to know this. Because anyone that's going to give you a definitive answer when it comes to this stuff, I would encourage you to seek a secondary opinion. And the reason why I would say that is because you can't speak for other people. Okay, so if you're talking to someone that says, this is what's going to happen and they're going to accept this, they don't have an authority to speak on what someone else is going to accept. They can give you scenarios, but if you're hungry for more and more data before you make a decision, fortune favors the bold. So you have to get enough information to say, I think this is where it's going to go and move it forward, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to have it reversed where your creditors are in control of the situation. And that's where this comes in here. What can your creditors do? Well, if it's a secured creditor, they can seize the assets. Okay, so if you haven't paid, they can come, get a bailiff, seize the asset. And if you're an entrepreneur and you've used that asset for your business, they can also sue you for the balance. So I know you might have heard of seize or sue here in Alberta. That doesn't apply for businesses. Okay. Unsecured creditors, they can get a court judgment against you and then garnish your receivables and seize your accounts. Trade creditors can register liens on properties if you don't pay them. And Canada Revenue Agency can arbitrarily assess the debt if your taxes aren't filed. So they can just say, okay, well, I think you made this much money, and guess what? Now you owe that to them. So it's important that you're filing your taxes and you're keeping proper books and records, because the other thing that CRA can do is they can seize bank accounts and register writs on real property that effectively turn them into secured creditors. So if you tried to sell it, they would actually have security on that when the lien was searched. Also, it will impact, of course, your credit report. So any consolidation loan order, like an OPD or a consumer proposal, it'll stay on your credit report for 3 years after you've completed the order, to a maximum of 6 years. If you've been bankrupt only one time, it'll stay on your credit report for 6 years after you're done. But if you've used it a secondary time, it'll be on there for 14 years after you're done. So when you think about that, imagine that this is your second bankruptcy. You're in this for 3 years because you make over a certain amount of money. 3 years plus 14, that's 17 years. So bankruptcy in many ways is yesterday's solutions. That's not typically what we as a people use as much anymore to restructure people's debts. The failure to keep arrangements that you make with your creditors will also have a negative impact on your credit report. But if you get a consolidation loan and pay all of this out, there is really no negative impact on it. Now, before you get a consolidation loan, of course, what the creditor's going to want to look at is their assets they can secure against and that are free and clear, and can they get any sort of secondary co-signers. If you have any debts that are placed in collection, your credit rating is going to be essentially the same as where it's at in a bankruptcy. Now, we speak of credit reports because a lot of times people are concerned about this, but I really want you to understand that when it comes to credit ratings, although it's fair to be concerned about something like that, the way the analogy I'll use is that if your house is on fire, the best thing to do is get out of your house as fast as possible. Now, you may say, but wait a second, I have a casserole in the oven, and I need to get the casserole out of the oven, otherwise it's going to burn and I'm going to have nothing to eat. And while that's true, the best thing to do is get yourself out of the house first and get yourself safe, and then look to how you'll get your casserole, how you'll have your meal. So these are just some infographics that I was going to go through, but probably what we can do is we can provide these out rather than go through this now, because I see that we have only 9 minutes. This is a little bit of information about us. We're a licensed insolvency trustee, and one of our big focuses, of course, is to normalize the conversation of debt within the community. So our big focus is establishing trust within the community and making sure that we treat everyone with grace and respect and provide impartial and unbiased information and commentary, provide a library of resources to support continuous growth, which is kind of what we're doing today. And of course, we foster the diversity of individual perspectives. So it's important to understand that when you're looking at something like this, you are a player in this. Your interaction with your trustee that you choose is very important, that you understand that you have a good positive relationship with them. So